Welcome back, everybody. Today we're diving into a book that has stirred up a lot of debate. It's called Woke Racism by John McWhorter. Now, before we get into all of this,
Yeah.
it's important to know, where McWhorter's coming from. He's a black liberal academic and linguist,
Right.
and he's not, arguing against protest or the fundamental idea behind Black Lives Matter or anything like that. But he is taking aim at what he sees as a new and potentially harmful form of anti-racism. That's kind of taken root in our culture today.
Yeah, that's right. McWhorter is really trying to dissect a very specific strain of thought, one that he refers to as third-wave anti-racism. And he argues that this ideology, while it's often presented as progressive and even anti-racist, it can actually be detrimental to the very people that it claims to champion.
Yeah, and he starts off right away in the book
Mm.
by being very clear about who his target audience is.
Sure.
So in the first chapter, which is called What This Book Is Not, he explains that he's not talking to, people who deny the existence of racism or those who actively perpetuate it.
Yeah. He's really addressing two groups. One is well-meaning white liberals who have adopted what he sees as a performative and often self-serving form of anti-racism. And then he's also speaking to Black people who, in his view, have internalized a sense of perpetual victimhood.
And I think one of the things that makes his book so interesting is that he uses a lot of really compelling examples to illustrate his points. And so right at the beginning, he talks about the case of Alison Roman.
Oh, yeah.
She was a white food writer who was publicly shamed and lost work for criticizing Chrissy Teigen and Marie Kondo, who were both women of color.
Right.
And so on the surface, this might seem like a straightforward example of a white person, unfairly criticizing women of color. But McWhorter points out the irony here. Both Teigen and Kondo are incredibly wealthy and successful.
Extremely.
So in terms of power dynamics, you could even argue that Roman was actually in a less privileged position.
Yeah, you could definitely argue that.
And yet she was accused of punching down simply for expressing an opinion. So McWhorter argues that this incident reveals how this new form of anti-racism can often operate in a way that's completely divorced from actual power dynamics. It's more about, adhering to a rigid set of rules and performing wokeness than it is about addressing any real inequalities.
Yeah, it's more about the performance than about actual change or progress. And that brings us to the heart of what McWhorter calls third-wave anti-racism. He sees it as characterized by this set of dogmatic beliefs that he calls the catechism of contradictions. One of the most striking examples is the simultaneous insistence that, silence is violence, right? But also this idea that you can never understand what it is to be Black.
Right. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. On the one hand, you're expected to constantly speak out against racism, but on the other hand, you're told that if you're not Black, you can never truly understand the experience of racism. So it creates a real double bind, especially for those who are trying to engage in this conversation in good faith.
Exactly, and it makes it difficult to have any kind of meaningful dialogue because you're constantly worried about saying the wrong thing or being accused of not understanding, which of course shuts down the conversation entirely.
And it's interesting because he also talks about how this ideology has permeated academia, particularly in the humanities. He gives this example of a lecture on My Fair Lady, where the main takeaway was that Professor Higgins is suppressing Eliza Doolittle's voice because he talks more than she does.
Interesting.
Which, that might be one interpretation of the play. But McWhorter's point is that this singular focus on power dynamics can really limit our understanding and appreciation of art and literature. It's almost like you can't just enjoy a work for its beauty or storytelling without being obligated to dissect it through this very specific lens.
Right, and it becomes this kind of litmus test where everything has to be evaluated based on its adherence to this particular ideology, and if it falls short, then it's dismissed as problematic or oppressive, which again really limits the scope of our intellectual inquiry.
And this leads into his central argument, which he lays out in the second chapter, which he calls the new religion. And his argument is that this new form of anti-racism is more than just a set of ideas or principles. It's actually functioning as a religion, complete with its own doctrines, rituals, and even a sense of moral superiority.
It's funny because when I first heard about this book, I thought that framing was a bit provocative, comparing anti-racism to a religion. But when you actually read the book, it's clear that he's not saying this is some kind of cynical ploy for power or control. He actually believes that many people who subscribe to this ideology are genuinely well-intentioned.
I think that's an important distinction to make, because it would be easy to dismiss this as just another attack on the left. But McWhorter is coming from a place of genuine concern. He's worried that these good intentions are being channeled into a belief system that can ultimately be more harmful than helpful.
Exactly. He's not trying to demonize anyone. He's trying to have an honest conversation about the potential downsides of this ideology.
So let's delve into this idea of the new religion a little bit more. What are some of the specific characteristics that he uses to support this claim?
Well, one of the key elements of any religion is the presence of rituals, right? And in this case, we see things like the raised hand gesture signifying white privilege, or the land acknowledgments that are becoming increasingly common at events and gatherings.
And the constant apologies and self-flagellation.
Yes, exactly. It's like this performative display of guilt and atonement. And then there's a clear hierarchy of authority, with figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Robin DiAngelo treated as prophets or clergy. Their writings are like sacred texts that can't be questioned or challenged.
Right. And of course, no religion is complete without the concept of sin. And in this case, the original sin is white privilege.
Oh, absolutely. There's this constant need to acknowledge and atone for one's privilege, which McWhorter compares to the Catholic practice of confession.
And then you have the practice of excommunicating heretics, which we
Mhm.
see in the form of cancel culture and the attempts to punish anyone who deviates from the accepted dogma.
Right. Anyone who dares to question the orthodoxy is immediately branded a heretic and cast out. And we've seen so many examples of this in recent years. People losing their jobs, their platforms, their reputations, simply for expressing an opinion that goes against the grain.
And he actually uses a really interesting example in the book, the case of MIT chaplain Daniel Patrick Maloney, who was forced to resign for suggesting that we should try to understand why even police officers who commit murder might stray from the path of good.
I remember that case. It was so controversial.
It was a very nuanced and compassionate perspective, one that acknowledged the horror of police brutality while also urging for understanding and forgiveness. But it was deemed unacceptable by those who saw it as a betrayal of the faith.
Right, because it challenged the simplistic narrative of good versus evil, which is so central to this ideology.
And that's where I think the analogy to religion becomes really insightful. Because just as in traditional religions, there's a sense that questioning or dissenting from the established doctrines is a form of heresy, something to be punished and silenced.
Right, it's like you're not allowed to think for yourself. You have to accept the dogma without question.
And McWhorter argues that this is deeply problematic because it stifles open dialogue and prevents us from grappling with complex issues in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it creates this echo chamber where everyone is just repeating the same talking points, and any dissenting voices are quickly silenced.
And that's something that I think we should all be concerned about, regardless of our political beliefs.
I agree. We need to be able to have these difficult conversations without fear of being canceled or ostracized.
Exactly. We need to be able to engage with different perspectives and challenge each other's ideas
Yeah.
in a way that is respectful and productive.
Absolutely. That's how we learn and grow, and that's how we make progress as a society. And this leads us to, I think, one of the most interesting chapters in the book, which is chapter 3. What attracts people to this religion?
Hmm.
It's a question that I think a lot of people have been asking. Why has this particular ideology gained so much traction, especially among white liberals?
It is a fascinating question, isn't it? Like, why would intelligent, well-intentioned people be drawn to a belief system that, as McWhorter argues, can actually be harmful?
Yeah, it's like a paradox almost.
Right.
And I think McWhorter offers a really insightful analysis. He suggests that it's a combination of factors. One is this desire for moral clarity in a world that often feels very complex and chaotic. And this ideology offers this very simple black and white framework for understanding racism,
Mm.
which can be very appealing, especially in a time when things feel very uncertain.
Yeah. It's like everything is so nuanced these days.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tempting to want to just simplify things and have clear-cut answers.
Right, exactly. And he talks about this concept of folk politics, which is this idea that, these complex issues get boiled down to these easily digestible slogans and sound bites, and it makes it very easy to feel like you're on the right side of history without Yeah. actually having to grapple with the nuances.
So you just kind of signal your virtue without actually having to do the hard work of understanding the complexities of the issue.
Right, it's like checking a box.
And I think another factor that he touches on is guilt,
Oh, absolutely. Guilt is a huge motivator.
especially for white liberals who are, constantly being told that they are complicit in a system that benefits them, even if it's on a subconscious level.
Yeah, and this ideology offers them a way to kind of atone for that guilt by acknowledging their privilege and constantly engaging in acts of self-criticism.
It's almost like self-flagellation becomes this path to a sense of moral superiority, even if it doesn't actually lead to any tangible change in the real world.
Right. It's like a way to absolve themselves of responsibility without actually having to do anything to change the system.
So you can kind of feel good about yourself without actually having to make any sacrifices.
Exactly. And he even touches on this concept of Western masochism, which is this tendency in Western culture to find a certain appeal in guilt and self-criticism, particularly when it comes to issues of race and colonialism.
So there's almost this like perverse pleasure in feeling bad about yourself. Like it's a way to prove how woke you are.
Right. And it's very seductive because it makes you feel like you're doing something meaningful, even when you're not.
So people are drawn to this ideology for a variety of reasons, some of which might be more about personal satisfaction than actual social change. But then McWhorter takes it a step further and he asks, what's wrong with this being a religion? And that's the focus of chapter 4. What's wrong with it being a religion?
And this is where I think he gets to the heart of his concern.
Yeah.
He's not just saying that this is a religion. He's saying that it's a religion that is ultimately harmful because it replaces reason and evidence-based solutions with dogma.
And you said earlier that he's particularly concerned about the effects this has on Black people.
Oh, absolutely.
Could you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. McWhorter argues that this focus on victimhood and grievance can actually undermine Black agency and empowerment.
How so?
Well, he argues that it creates this distorted view of reality, where racism is seen as the sole explanation for any disparities.
So it's like this idea that Black people are perpetually helpless victims.
Right. And this can lead to policies that actually harm Black communities.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, he talks about the push to reduce disciplinary action against Black boys in schools. Now, on the surface, this might seem like a well-intentioned policy, aimed at addressing racial bias.
Right.
But McWhorter argues that it can actually create unsafe learning environments for other students.
Many of whom are also Black.
Exactly. And it ignores the fact that there are other factors that contribute to disciplinary disparities, like poverty, for example.
Yeah.
So it's like this very simplistic solution that doesn't actually address the root causes of the problem.
And again, can actually end up hurting the very people that it's supposed to help.
Exactly.
And he also talks about how this ideology overlooks the role of cultural factors in perpetuating disparity.
Oh, yeah, that's another important point.
Like he discusses the acting white phenomenon.
Right.
Where Black students who excel academically are sometimes accused of betraying their race.
Right. It's like this internalized racism, where Black people are policing each other and enforcing these very narrow definitions of what it means to be Black.
And McWhorter argues that this is a legacy of past racism
Absolutely.
that continues to impact Black communities even as overt discrimination has decreased.
Right. So it's not just about external racism. It's also about the ways in which racism has been internalized and how that continues to shape Black identity and behavior.
And McWhorter doesn't shy away from tackling controversial topics. He even dives into the debate surrounding the 1619 Project.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, Nicole Hannah-Jones's claim that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery.
Right. Which is a claim that has been widely disputed by historians.
Exactly. And McWhorter argues that it remains largely unchallenged.
Yeah.
Because of this cultural climate where questioning a Black person's perspective on race is often seen as taboo.
Right. It's like you can't disagree with a Black person on anything related to race without being accused of being racist.
So even if there's historical evidence to the contrary.
Exactly. It's like evidence doesn't matter anymore. It's all about feelings and lived experience.
And McWhorter is very critical of that way of thinking.
Yeah, he argues that it's dangerous because it prioritizes emotional appeals over reason and evidence.
And it prevents us from having honest and open debates about these important issues.
Exactly. And he also critiques the way in which affirmative action policies, while they may be well-intentioned, can sometimes backfire by placing Black students in academic environments where they are not adequately prepared to compete.
Yeah, he talks about this concept of mismatch theory.
Right.
Which is the idea that trying to achieve diversity through racial preferences can sometimes harm the very students that it's meant to help.
Exactly. It's like you're setting them up for failure.
Right.
Because they're not given the support that they need to succeed. And it can lead to higher dropout rates and feelings of inadequacy, even though the intention was to promote diversity.
So the classic example of good intentions gone wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And he extends this critique to the realm of literature and academia. He argues that there's this immense pressure on Black writers and thinkers to focus solely on race and racism, which stifles intellectual curiosity and limits the scope of their contributions.
So it's like this idea that Black artists and scholars must constantly be in resistance mode.
Right, yeah.
which can be incredibly limiting and even dehumanizing.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like you're reducing them to just their race and ignoring all of their other talents and interests.
And in Chapter 5, Beyond Dismantling Structures, Saving Black America for Real, he proposes a different approach.
Yeah.
He suggests that we need to focus on pragmatic, evidence-based solutions that address the root causes of disparities, rather than getting caught up in performative displays of anti-racism.
It's like he's saying, okay, enough with the virtue signaling. Let's actually do something that's going to make a difference.
So instead of focusing on guilt and blame, he's advocating for a more practical and solutions-oriented approach.
Yeah.
And he actually highlights 3 key areas where he believes we should be focusing our efforts.
Yeah, what are those?
Okay, so first, he emphasizes the importance of ending the war on drugs,
Of course.
which, as we know, has disproportionately impacted Black communities,
Mhm.
leading to mass incarceration and the breakdown of families.
Right, it's one of the biggest drivers of racial inequality in this country.
Exactly. And it's something that many have been advocating for years.
Yeah.
And McWhorter sees it as a crucial step towards creating a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely.
Second, he advocates for implementing phonics-based reading instruction in schools.
Oh, yeah.
Research has consistently shown that phonics is a more effective method for teaching reading than the whole language approach that is often favored in under-resourced schools.
Yeah, and it's something that could have a huge impact on closing the achievement gap.
Right, so it's about prioritizing what actually works based on evidence,
Yeah.
rather than getting bogged down in ideological debates that ultimately don't benefit the students.
Yeah, let's follow the science.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then finally, he encourages a shift in mindset towards vocational training as a viable and respectable pathway to success.
Interesting.
He challenges the idea that everyone needs a 4-year college degree.
Right.
And he argues that we should be promoting vocational schools as a legitimate option for those who are more inclined towards hands-on practical skills.
Yeah, and there's such a stigma against vocational training. Like it's somehow seen as less than a 4-year college degree.
Right. And McWhorter is really pushing back against that.
Yeah, he's saying that we need to expand our definition of success
Right.
and recognize that there are multiple paths to a fulfilling and prosperous life.
And I think that's so important,
Yeah.
especially in a time when college is becoming increasingly expensive.
Absolutely. Not everyone needs to go to college. And there are so many good-paying jobs that don't require a 4-year degree.
And it's refreshing to hear someone advocating for solutions that don't rely on guilt or shame.
Right. It's about empowering people, giving them the tools and resources they need to succeed,
Yeah.
rather than constantly reminding them of their victimhood.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final chapter of the book, How Do We Work Around Them?
Yeah.
And this is where McWhorter offers some very practical advice on how to resist the influence of what he calls the elect, those who subscribe to this new form of anti-racism.
Yeah, the true believers.
Right. And I have to admit, I was really curious about this part of the book
Right.
because it feels like this ideology has become so pervasive,
It really has.
so entrenched in our institutions,
Absolutely.
it can feel almost impossible to challenge.
Yeah, it's like you're swimming against the tide.
Right. But McWhorter emphasizes that we are not powerless.
Right. We can fight back.
Yeah.
We just need to be strategic about it.
And he stresses the importance of recognizing and calling out their tactics.
Yeah, like what are they actually doing? How are they manipulating us?
Right. And he encourages readers to stand firm in their beliefs
Yeah, have courage.
and refuse to be intimidated by accusations of racism,
Right. Don't let them shame you into silence.
because that's what they want.
Exactly. They want to shut down the conversation,
Right.
and they want to make you feel like you're the bad guy just for daring to question their orthodoxy.
And McWhorter says that's exactly what you shouldn't do.
Right.
You should stand your ground,
And speak your truth,
even if it's uncomfortable,
even if it makes people angry.
because that's how we change things.
Right. We have to be willing to have those difficult conversations.
And to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely.
And he also highlights the need to support individuals and institutions that are challenging this ideology
Yeah.
because there's strength in numbers. Like the example we talked about earlier, Trader Joe's refusing to rename its ethnic food lines despite pressure to do so.
Yeah. That's a great example. They didn't cave.
Right. They stood their ground.
And they said, no, we're not going to do this. This is ridiculous.
And he also talks about the academics who spoke out against the Princeton Manifesto. That labeled the university as inherently racist.
Right.
These are individuals and institutions that are pushing back against this ideology,
Yeah.
and they deserve our support
Absolutely.
because they're showing us that it is possible to resist,
Right.
that we don't have to just accept this as the new normal.
And it can be really inspiring to see those examples of resistance, especially in a climate that can feel so stifling.
Yeah, it gives you hope.
Right. It shows you that you're not alone.
And McWhorter actually provides some very practical tips on how to engage in conversations with people who subscribe to this ideology.
Yeah.
So, like, if you find yourself in a situation where you're talking to someone who's really bought into this way of thinking,
Yeah.
what do you do?
Well, first of all, he says you have to stay calm. Don't get defensive. Don't let them bait you into an argument,
Right.
because that's just going to escalate the situation.
And it's not going to be productive.
Exactly. So stay calm and then stand your ground. Don't let them bully you into agreeing with them.
So don't be afraid to disagree.
Right. And don't be afraid to say, I don't agree with that.
And he also emphasizes that you don't have to accept their definitions or framing of the issue.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
So if they're trying to define racism in a way that you don't agree with,
Right.
you can push back on that.
Absolutely. You can say, that's not my definition of racism.
Right.
And here's why.
Right.
And you can offer alternative perspectives without getting trapped in their circular logic.
And he even gives some sample scripts for responding to common talking points.
Yeah, he does.
For example, if someone accuses you of being racist,
Right.
he suggests countering with something like, you're saying I'm a racist, but I'm more committed to actually helping poor people of color than you are.
Oh, I like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a way of shifting the focus from abstract accusations to concrete actions.
Yeah, it's like put your money where your mouth is.
Right.
Don't just talk about it. Actually do something.
Show me what you're doing to actually address the problem.
Right. And he encourages readers to draw inspiration from those who have successfully resisted this ideology.
Like the Trader Joe's example.
Right.
Or the academics who challenged the Princeton Manifesto.
Yeah.
These are people who stood up for what they believed in, even when it was unpopular.
Right.
And they faced a lot of backlash.
They did.
But they didn't back down.
No, they didn't.
And that's inspiring.
It is.
It's about recognizing that you're not alone in this.
Right.
There are others who are concerned about the direction that this ideology is taking us.
Absolutely.
And McWhorter reminds us that there are countless people who are also troubled by this ideology, and together we can push back
Yeah.
and reclaim our ability to think critically
Right.
and engage in open dialogue.
That's the key. Open dialogue.
Yeah.
We need to be able to talk to each other, even when we disagree. It's
Exactly.
about fear of being canceled or ostracized.
And that's a message that I think is really important, especially in today's climate.
Absolutely. It's a message that we all need to hear.
So what do you think?
About McWhorter's proposed solutions, do you think they're realistic?
I mean, I think they're definitely worth considering. Ending the war on drugs, implementing phonics-based reading instruction, promoting vocational training. These are all policies that could potentially have a significant impact on addressing racial disparities.
Yeah.
And they're not based on guilt or shame.
Right.
They're based on evidence.
And they're focused on empowering people
Right.
rather than making them feel like victims.
So I think they're definitely worth exploring further.
I agree. And I think McWhorter's book does a really good job of laying out the case for these solutions.
Yeah.
And he also provides a lot of data and research to support his arguments.
So it's not just his opinion.
Right.
It's based on evidence.
And I think that's really important.
Because we need to move beyond these emotional appeals
Right.
and start focusing on what actually works.
Yeah. Let's be pragmatic about this.
Right.
Let's look at the evidence and let's implement solutions that are actually going to make a difference.
And McWhorter's book gives us a roadmap for doing that.
Yeah, it does.
So I highly recommend checking it out.
Absolutely, especially if you're interested in these issues.
And even if you disagree with him,
yeah.
I think it's important to engage with his arguments because he's raising some really important questions
Yeah, he is.
about the way we talk about race in this country.
And the way we approach these issues.
Exactly.
And I think those are conversations that we need to be having.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most valuable things about his book is that he doesn't just leave us with a critique. He actually offers a path forward, a way to address these issues in a more constructive and effective way.
Yeah, he's not just complaining. He's actually trying to find solutions.
Right.
And I think that's what makes his book so important.
It's not just about tearing things down. It's
Right.
about building something better.
Exactly.
And he's really challenging us to think differently about these issues.
He is.
To move beyond the slogans and the soundbite
Right.
and to really grapple with the complexities.
And to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, because that's where the real growth happens.
Absolutely.
And when we're willing to challenge our own beliefs.
Right.
And to listen to perspectives that are different from our own.
And to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Exactly.
Because none of us has all the answers.
Right.
And I think that's something that McWhorter really emphasizes in his book.
Yeah, he's very humble in that way.
He is.
He's not claiming to have all the answers.
No.
He's just trying to start a conversation.
And I think that's what we need more of.
Absolutely.
More dialogue, more open-mindedness.
More willingness to listen.
And to learn from each other.
Yeah.
Because that's how we're going to make progress on these issues.
And I think McWhorter's book is a really valuable contribution to that conversation.
I agree.
So if you're interested in learning more about this,
Yeah.
highly recommend checking it out.
Me too. It's definitely worth reading.
It's called Woke Racism by John McWhorter. Well, that's it for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.